There is a room in the British Museum where the air feels different. Not colder, not darker, just different. In the way that certain places carry the weight of something that has waited a very long time to be found. The objects inside are small. Most are no larger than a human hand. Many are broken at the edges. Some are the color of pale sand. Others have darkened over time to something closer to charcoal. They are made of clay, and they are very, very old. If you stood in that room and held one of those tablets, if a curator placed it carefully into your palms, and you felt its weight, its smoothness, the faint texture of the marks pressed into its surface thousands of years before you were born, you might feel something you could not immediately name. Not quite awe, not quite fear. Something quieter than both. The feeling of something that has been waiting patiently across an unimaginable distance of time. These tablets were made in a place the ancient Greeks called Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. What is today the country of Iraq? The civilization that emerged there, Sumer, is among the oldest ever documented by archaeology. It appeared sometime around 4500 BCE, perhaps earlier. The people who built it were the first in human history to develop a system of writing. They pressed the tips of cut reeds into soft clay and left behind small, wedge-shaped marks arranged in careful, deliberate rows. We call that writing cuneiform, and with it, the Sumerians recorded everything: their laws, their trade, their observations of the stars, their mathematics, their medicine, their poetry, their grief, and their gods. The gods they wrote about were called the Anunnaki. That word has become, in recent decades, one of the most searched and most distorted terms in all of ancient history. It appears in late-night documentaries, in paperback books with embossed gold lettering, in corners of the internet where speculation travels faster than scholarship. But what the word actually means, what the tablets actually say, is almost always buried beneath that noise. So let us go back to the clay. Let us go back to what was actually written in the oldest language humanity ever pressed into the earth. The word Anunnaki does not translate, as popular culture has long insisted, to those who from heaven came. That translation was introduced in the 20th century by a writer named Zecharia Sitchin, whose books captured the imagination of millions, but were rejected consistently and carefully by the academic scholars who spent their careers reading these texts in the original Sumerian and Akkadian. The more accurate translation, the one the philological evidence supports, is quieter and in some ways far more interesting. Anunnaki means most precisely in something like princely offspring, those of noble seed, the great ones, the ones of high descent, not visitors from another worlds, but a divine lineage, a hierarchy, a family of beings, vast in number and organized in rank, who governed the cosmos from the heavens above to the deep earth below. This is where the story actually begins, not with sensation, not with ancient astronauts or forbidden knowledge or secret histories, with a hierarchy, a council, a system of power, and with the specific, detailed, deeply unsettling things that council decided to do. At the top of the Anunnaki hierarchy stood three figures: Anu, the sky, the father of gods, the source of all divine authority, whose decrees, the tablets say, could not be reversed by any force in the cosmos. Enlil, the lord of wind and earth, the one who held the tablet of destinies, who issued the decrees that shaped the fate of all living things, of the rise of kings and the fall of cities and the silencing of fields. And Enki, the lord of the deep waters, the god of wisdom and craft, the one who understood better than any other being the mechanics of creation itself. These three presided over an assembly. The texts call it the Ubshukina, the great gathering place where the Anunnaki met to deliberate and to decide. And what happened in that assembly, as the tablets record it, is what makes careful readers go very quiet. The oldest and most complete account of why human beings were created appears in a text known as the Atrahasis Epic. It is among the earliest narratives in the entire written record of humanity, older than the Iliad by more than 1,000 years. Fragments of it were first found in the ruins of the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh in the 1850s, during the early age of Mesopotamian excavation. Additional pieces have surfaced since, at sites scattered across the ancient Near East. And when scholars finally assembled these fragments into something approaching a complete text, what they found was a creation story unlike almost any other in the ancient world. The Atrahasis does not begin with light or with void or with a divine act of pure creative will. It begins with labor. Before human beings existed, the text explains, the work of maintaining the physical earth, digging the great canals, moving the soil, managing the flow of the rivers, was performed by a class of divine beings called the Igigi. The Igigi worked under the authority of the Anunnaki. They labored for what the text describes as an enormous span of time, and eventually, exhausted beyond endurance, they refused. The rebellion the Atrahasis describes is vivid in a way that does not feel like mythology. The Igigi gather in the darkness of the night. They set fire to their tools. They march together toward the house of Enlil, the one who has directed their labor, and they surround it completely. The noise they make wakes Enlil from sleep. He is frightened. The text says this plainly without apology. He sends his vizier Nusku outside to see what is happening. And when Nusku returns, Enlil calls an emergency meeting of the Great Assembly. Anu descends from the sky. Enki is summoned from the deep. The three greatest of the Anunnaki sit together in council in the middle of the night to decide what must be done about a labor force that will no longer work. It is Enki who proposes the solution, and the solution he proposes is the creation of humanity. He will make a new being shaped from clay, yes, as in many ancient traditions, but also from something else. The tablets are specific about this, precise in a way that is difficult to dismiss as mere poetic embellishment. A god must be slain. A god named We'ila, described as possessing intelligence, is brought before the assembly and killed. His flesh and blood are mixed into the clay, and from this mixture, in a ritual conducted by the goddess Nintu, the first human beings are formed. 14 of them, 7 male and 7 female, shaped from earth and divine substance together. Their purpose is stated in the text without hesitation. without metaphor, without the softening language of theology. They are created, the Atrahasis says, to bear the labor of the gods, to dig the canals, to move the earth, to do the work that the Igigi refused to continue doing. The creation of humanity, in the oldest written account of that creation ever recovered from the earth, is not an act of love. It is a management decision, a solution to a crisis, reached in a council chamber in the middle of the night by beings who had a problem and needed it solved. This is the passage that stays with people, not because it is impossible to place within a mythological context. Ancient religions across the world understood human existence in terms of service to the divine, but because of the way it is written, the Atrahasis does not speak in the abstract language of spiritual purpose. It speaks in the specific, practical language of a record, a labor shortage, a rebellion, a proposal, a vote, a creation. The logic it describes is not the logic of sacred mystery. It is the logic of power. So of a ruling class that creates a working class to perform labor it no longer wishes to perform. Of beings with authority making decisions about beings who have not yet come into existence and therefore cannot consent to the terms of their own creation. On that night, in that assembly, the decision was made, and the tablets record that it was carried out exactly as Enki proposed. The new beings were formed, they woke, and they began to work. What none of the tablets record, what no fragment ever recovered has been found to contain, is whether the first human beings were ever told why they had been made, whether in those first moments of consciousness any of the gods thought it necessary to explain, whether Wei Ila, the god whose death made their existence possible, was ever acknowledged in the work they performed each day. The clay does not say. In that silence, pressing up through 4,000 years of earth and stone, is perhaps the most unsettling thing the Anunnaki Tablets contain. There is something the Atrahasis does not tell you immediately. It reveals it slowly, the way certain truths reveal themselves, not in a single moment of clarity, but across many readings, many quiet nights, many returns to the same lines that seemed ordinary at first, and then gradually do not. The thing the Atrahasis does not tell you immediately is that the creation of humanity did not solve the problem the gods had hoped it would solve. That the beings made from clay and divine blood were from almost the very beginning too alive, too loud, too present, too insistently, uncomfortably real. The text says this plainly. After the first human beings are created and set to work, time passes. Generations accumulate, the population grows, and then the tablets record something that sounds, because at first, almost absurd, almost too human to belong to a story about gods. Enlil, the Lord of the earth, cannot sleep. The noise of humanity, the noise of all these people living and working and moving across the surface of the world, disturbs him, keeps him awake in the darkness. And so Enlil, in the way of those who hold absolute power, decides that the noise must stop. What follows in the Atrahasis is a sequence of events that will feel familiar to anyone who has read the flood narratives of other ancient traditions. But the familiarity is deceptive, because in the Atrahasis, the flood is not the beginning of the story. It is the end of a longer, more deliberate campaign. Before the flood, Enlil tries other methods. He sends plague. He sends drought. He withholds the rains until the fields go dry and the rivers shrink and the people begin to die in great numbers. Each time, the human population recovers. Each time, Enki, who created humanity, who carries something of Wa'ila's intelligence within his own divine nature, who cannot bring himself to watch his creation destroyed, finds a way to warn the people, to help them survive, to quietly undo what Enlil has decreed. This tension between Enlil and Enki runs through the Atrahasis like a fault line. It is not a simple conflict between good and evil. The tablets do not frame it that way. Enlil is not a villain. He is a being with authority, exercising that authority as he understands it, disturbed by something he did not fully anticipate when he approved Enki's proposal in the council chamber that night. And Enki is not straightforwardly heroic. He is a being with divided loyalties, loyal to the assembly, loyal to the decrees of the great gods, and yet unable to entirely abandon the beings he shaped from clay and blood and his own particular genius. He works around Enlil rather than against him. He finds gaps. He whispers through walls. He never openly defies the council's decisions. He simply ensures again and again that the consequences of those decisions are not quite as final as Enlil intends. It is in this tension between destruction and preservation, between the authority of the assembly and the quiet interventions of its most gifted member, that the Atrahasis locates what it seems to understand as the fundamental condition of humanity. Created by a council, sustained by a dissenter, existing in the space between a power that periodically wishes it would go away and a creator who cannot quite let it. Few people know that this dynamic, this specific triangle of Anu's distant authority, Enlil's troubled dominion, and Enki's protective ambivalence, repeats across virtually every major Sumerian and Akkadian text in which human beings appear. It is not incidental, it is structural. The Anunnaki Tablets, taken together, present a cosmos in which the relationship between the divine and the human is never settled, never resolved into simple worship and simple blessing, always complicated by history, by the memory of how humanity came to exist in the first place, by the knowledge, held somewhere in the divine assembly, of what was done and why. The flood, when it finally comes in the Atrahasis, is Enlil's final solution, a decision reached in the assembly after the plague and the drought have both failed. The language the tablets use for this decision is bureaucratic in a way that is almost more disturbing than overt cruelty would be. The great gods convene, they deliberate, they vote, and they decide that the flood will come and that it will be total, again that nothing will survive it. The decision is recorded as a decree, formal, official, irreversible, but Enki does not accept it as irreversible. What he does next is one of the most carefully described acts of divine disobedience in all of ancient literature. He cannot warn a human being directly. The decree of the assembly forbids it. So he finds a way around the decree. He goes to the house of a man named Atrahasis, whose name means in Akkadian, is exceedingly wise, and he speaks not to the man himself, but to the wall of his house. He tells the wall what is coming. He instructs the wall on what must be built: a boat large enough to carry the seed of all living things, sealed with pitch, stocked with provisions, ready before the rains begin. The wall, of course, has no ears, but Atrahasis is on the other side of it, and he hears every word. This detail, Enki speaking to a wall, and technically honoring the letter of the assembly's decree while utterly violating its spirit, is one of the moments scholars return to repeatedly when they discuss the Anunnaki texts. It reveals something about the way the tablets understand divine power that is more nuanced and more troubling than simple omnipotence. The gods of the Anunnaki tradition are not all-powerful in the way that later theological traditions would describe divinity. They are constrained by their own rules, their own procedures, their own politics, and the most resourceful among them, Enki, always Enki, navigates those constraints not by breaking them openly, but by finding the precise angle at which they can be bent without technically breaking. After the flood, when the waters finally recede and Atrahasis emerges from the boat and offers sacrifice, and the smell of the burning reaches the gods in their assembly, something happens that the tablets record with a restraint that somehow makes it more affecting. The gods are hungry. During the flood, there were no human beings to perform the rituals, to maintain the temples, to offer the food and incense and prayers that the divine beings had come over generations to depend on. The gods gather around the smoke of Atrahasis' sacrifice, like people gathered around a fire after a long time in the cold. Enlil, when he discovers that human beings have survived, that Enki's intervention has preserved what the assembly voted to destroy, is furious. The text describes his anger in vivid terms. But the flood is over. The man is alive. The seed of humanity has been preserved in the belly of the boat, floating on the surface of the water that was meant to erase it. And gradually, in the assembly that follows, a new arrangement is reached. Humanity will continue, but its terms of existence will be different. So death will be formalized, where before, the texts suggest, human beings may have lived for extraordinarily long spans of time. Now mortality will be structured, built in, insured. There will be women who cannot bear children. There will be priests and priestesses who do not reproduce. The population will be managed, contained, kept from this point forward at a level that does not disturb the sleep of the Lord of the earth. What the tablets record in this final arrangement is something that has no obvious parallel in any other ancient creation tradition. The existence of humanity is not simply given. It is negotiated, adjusted, revised after the first version proved unsatisfactory to those in authority. The human beings who emerge from the post-flood world of the Atrahasis are not the same as the ones who were first formed from clay and divine blood. They are a second draft, shaped not only by the original act of creation, but by the decisions made afterward, in council, in anger, in the complicated space between a god who wanted silence and a god who could not stop listening. This is what the Anunnaki Tablets say about the beginning of human life on Earth. Not a garden, not a divine breath breathed into dust with love and intention. A labor crisis, a rebellion, a proposal, a flood, a negotiation, and a second draft of a species that was never quite what its creators expected it to be. Too resilient, too numerous, too loud, too alive to be easily managed, and too connected through the blood and flesh of Wahila pressed into its very clay, to the divine substance it was never supposed to fully possess. The tablets do not editorialize about this. They do not suggest how the listener should feel. They simply record, carefully, in the oldest writing humanity ever produced, the story of how it came to exist in a world that was not entirely sure it wanted it there. There is a question that surfaces quietly after you have spent enough time with the Atrahasis, after you have followed the flood and the council and Enki's whispered warning to a wall, after you have sat with the image of the gods gathering hungrily around the smoke of a single man's sacrifice. The question is not theological. It is not philosophical in the grand sense. It is simpler than that, and more persistent. It is this. If the tablets are describing mythology, if this is simply the way an ancient people explained the world to themselves, then why does it read the way it does? Mythology, as a form, has recognizable qualities. It moves in archetypes. It speaks in symbols. Its gods are luminous and distant, and their actions carry the weight of metaphor. The Olympian gods of Greece are mythological in this way. Their stories are rich and complex and deeply human, but they exist at a remove. They are clearly larger than life, clearly operating in a register that is not the register of ordinary human experience. The same is true of the gods of Egypt, of the Vedic tradition, of the Norse cosmology. They are divine. They are other. They are not sitting in assembly rooms in the middle of the night, frightened by a noise outside their door, debating how to manage a labor shortage. And yet that is exactly what the Anunnaki are doing in the Sumerian texts. This is the quality that makes careful scholars pause, not the content of the stories, exactly, but the register in which they are told. The Anunnaki texts read less like mythology and more like, and this is a word that appears in the academic literature, used cautiously, used with full awareness of its implications, administrative records. Not records in the sense that they are dry or bureaucratic in their language. They are beautifully written, many of them, poetic in their imagery, so profound in their emotional weight. But their underlying structure, the way they organize events, the way they describe decisions being made and consequences following from those decisions, has a quality that is closer to history than to myth. Few people know that this observation was made not by fringe writers or popular historians, but by some of the most respected figures in Assyriology, the academic discipline devoted to the study of ancient Mesopotamian civilization. Thorkild Jacobson, one of the great scholars of Sumerian literature in the 20th century, wrote extensively about what he called the cosmic state of the Sumerian gods, the way the divine assembly mirrored, with striking precision, the political institutions of the Sumerian city-states. Samuel Noah Kramer, whose decades of work translating Sumerian texts produced some of the most important scholarship in the field, noted repeatedly the unusual specificity of the Anunnaki narratives, the named individuals, the described locations, the recorded decisions. These scholars were not suggesting that the tablets were literally true, but they were noting carefully that the tablets were doing something different from what most ancient religious texts do. They were presenting the divine world not as a realm of transcendent mystery, but as a structured, political, historically continuous reality. What history often overlooks is that this quality of the texts becomes even more pronounced when you move beyond the Atrahasis and begin to read the broader corpus of Anunnaki literature. Because the Atrahasis, for all its strangeness, is in some ways the most comprehensible of the major texts. Its narrative logic is followable. Its characters have clear motivations. Its events proceed in a sequence that, however disturbing, makes internal sense. But there are other texts in the Anunnaki corpus that are harder to place, that resist easy interpretation, that contain passages which translators have described in their notes and commentaries with a particular kind of careful, qualified uncertainty that is itself worth paying attention to. One of those texts is the Enuma Elish. The Enuma Elish is the great Babylonian creation epic, later than the Atrahasis in its final form, but drawing on Sumerian traditions that are considerably older. It begins not with the Anunnaki Council or with the creation of humanity, but with something prior to all of that, with the very beginning of existence itself. And what it describes at that beginning is, in its way, the most unsettling passage in the entire corpus. In the beginning, the Enuma Elish says, there was only water, not emptiness, not void, water. Two kinds of water commingled, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water, male and female. These two primordial waters existed together before anything else, before the sky, before the earth, before the gods themselves. And from their commingling, the first gods were born. The gods that emerge from Apsu and Tiamat are the earliest of the Anunnaki lineage. They are young and vital and full of energy, and they are, almost immediately, a problem. They are noisy. They move constantly. They disturb the ancient stillness of Apsu and Tiamat with their restless activity. Apsu, in language that will feel familiar after the Atrahasis, cannot sleep. He goes to Tiamat and tells her that he intends to destroy the young gods, his own offspring, so that he can have quiet again. This is the moment the Enuma Elish presents as the origin of conflict in the cosmos. Not a rebellion from below, as in the Atrahasis, but a decision from above. A parent who looks at the beings he has brought into existence and finds them intolerable, who reaches the conclusion that the solution to the noise they make is their elimination. The young gods discover Apsu's plan, and Enki, always Enki, across every text in this tradition, the one who acts when others hesitate, responds first. He casts a spell over Apsu. He puts him into a deep sleep, and then he kills him. He takes Apsu's body and builds from it his own dwelling place, the Abzu, the deep freshwater realm that will be Enki's home throughout all the subsequent texts. He takes Apsu's crown, he takes Apsu's radiance, and he installs himself in the space where the first and most ancient of all beings once existed. This is a significant moment in the Enuma Elish, and it tends to receive less attention than the more dramatic events that follow. But it is worth sitting with. Enki, the god of wisdom, the protector of humanity, the one who whispers through walls to save the species he created, begins his story in the Enuma Elish as a patricide, as the being who kills the most ancient of all gods and takes his power. The tablets do not present this as villainous, they present it as necessary, as the act that makes the ordered cosmos possible. But they do not hide it either. They record it plainly in the same matter-of-fact register they use for everything else. After Enki kills Apsu, Tiamat, the primordial salt water, the oldest mother, grieves. And then she prepares for war. What follows in the Enuma Elish is a cosmic battle of enormous scale. Tiamat assembles an army of monsters, 11 creatures. The tablets name them individually, each one a being of terrible power, and she appoints a god named Kingu as their commander. She gives Kingu the Tablet of Destinies, the object that confers supreme authority over the cosmos, and she marches against the younger gods who killed her consort. The assembly of the Anunnaki faces an existential crisis. One by one, the great gods are asked to face Tiamat. One by one, they cannot. The tablets describe their failure not with contempt, but with a kind of compassionate honesty. These are powerful beings, confronted with something more powerful than themselves, and they are afraid. Anu himself attempts to approach Tiamat and turns back. The assembly falls into despair. It is at this point that Marduk enters the story. Marduk is the son of Enki, young, brilliant, possessed of a particular quality the tablets describe with a term that translates roughly as the sharpest vision, the ability to see what others cannot. He comes before the assembly and he offers to face Tiamat. But he does not offer this as a simple act of courage. He offers it as a negotiation. If he defeats Tiamat, he tells the assembly he will take her place. He will hold the Tablet of Destinies. He will be the highest of all the gods. The assembly, with no other options, agrees. In that room, in that moment of desperation, the balance of divine power shifted forever. The tablets record the assembly's agreement with the same procedural language they use for every other decree: a motion, a discussion, a vote. And then Marduk goes out to face the chaos that the oldest being in the cosmos has unleashed upon the world. What happens next? The battle between Marduk and Tiamat. And what Marduk makes from her body after he defeats her is the moment in the Enuma Elish that has occupied scholars and philosophers and quiet readers in the night for as long as these texts have been translated. Because what Marduk does with Tiamat is not simply victory, it is transformation. It is the act that makes the physical world as we know it possible, and it is recorded in the tablets with a precision and a strangeness that has never been fully explained. Marduk stands before Tiamat, and the tablets describe what he sees. Not a goddess in the way the younger gods are gods, contained, defined, moving through the world in recognizable form. What Marduk sees is something older than form itself. Tiamat is vast. The tablets struggle, in their careful cuneiform, to convey the scale of her. She is the salt water. She is the deep. She is the thing that existed before existence had edges. And she has poured all of that ancient, some boundless nature into this moment of war, has shaped it into something that moves toward Marduk across the cosmic field with the accumulated grief and fury of the oldest being in the world. Marduk does not retreat. The battle that Enuma Elish describes is brief in its telling, but enormous in its implications. Marduk drives the winds before him, the evil wind, the whirlwind, the storm, and forces them into Tiamat's open mouth so that she cannot close it, cannot speak her power into being. And then he drives his spear into her distended body and splits her in two. The tablets record what happens next with extraordinary care. Marduk stands over the body of the defeated Tiamat, and he looks at what he has done, and then he begins to build. From her upper half, he makes the sky. He stretches it above the earth like a great ceiling and stations guards at its edges to ensure that her waters do not escape downward. From her lower half, he makes the earth itself, the ground beneath every human foot that has ever walked upon it. Her eyes become the sources of the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two rivers that gave life to Mesopotamia, the two rivers whose banks the people who wrote these tablets lived and worked and died beside. Her tail becomes the Milky Way, arching across the night sky. Her spittle becomes the clouds. This is the cosmology of the Enuma Elish. The physical world is not created from nothing. It is made from a body, from the remains of the most ancient being in existence, defeated in battle by the most gifted of the younger gods, shaped with deliberate intention into the structure that all subsequent life would inhabit. The sky above you and the earth below you are, in the understanding of the people who press these tablets into being, the divided halves of something that once lived, something that once grieved, something that once went to war. Few people know that this image, the world made from a primordial body, appears in ancient traditions far beyond Mesopotamia. The Norse cosmology has Ymir, the primordial giant, whose body becomes the world after he is slain by Odin and his brothers. The Vedic tradition has Purusha, the cosmic person, whose dismemberment produces the elements of the universe. These parallels have occupied comparative mythologists for generations. They suggest either a common human psychological tendency to understand creation in terms of sacrifice and transformation, or something older, a shared memory, perhaps, of stories told before these traditions diverged, carried forward in different languages, in different cultures, but preserving in their deep structure the same essential image. What makes the Enuma Elish unusual, even among these parallel traditions, is what Marduk does after he builds the world. He does not rest. He does not withdraw into divine remoteness. He goes back to the assembly of the Anunnaki, and he delivers what he has promised: order, structure, a cosmos that works. He assigns the gods to their stations. He organizes the calendar. He establishes the movements of the stars and the moon. He builds Babylon, the great city, the earthly reflection of the divine order, and he builds within it the temple Esagila, the house where the gods will dwell among human beings. And then, in the assembly, the question of humanity arises again. The gods are weary. Even now, even in this new and ordered cosmos, the maintenance of the world requires labor. The temples must be tended. The rituals must be performed. The canals must flow. And the gods, who have just fought a war, who have reorganized the entire structure of existence, who are exhausted in the way that beings are exhausted after the expenditure of enormous power, do not wish to perform this labor themselves. So Marduk proposes a solution. He will create human beings. But unlike the Atrahasis, where the creation of humanity is described primarily as a practical arrangement, the Enuma Elish adds a layer that is worth sitting with carefully. Marduk asks the assembly who is responsible for Tiamat's war, who counseled her, who urged her toward conflict. The assembly identifies Kingu, Tiamat's appointed commander, the one who wore the tablet of destinies around his neck as he led her armies. So Kingu is brought before the assembly. He is bound, and then he is killed. And from his blood, mixed with clay, humanity is made. This is the moment in the Enuma Elish that most directly parallels the Atrahasis, the slaying of a divine being whose substance becomes the raw material of human existence. But there is a difference. In the Atrahasis, Wa'ela is described simply as a god who possesses intelligence. The text does not elaborate on his character or his history. In the Enuma Elish, Kingu is someone we have met. He is Tiamat's champion. He is the one who bore the highest authority in the cosmos, however briefly. He is, in some readings of the text, the one who loved Tiamat, whom she elevated above all others, not only for strategic reasons, but because the tablets suggest something closer to devotion in their relationship. And it is from his blood that human beings are made. What the Enuma Elish is encoding in this choice is something that Mesopotamian scholars have debated for decades. Is it simply a narrative convenience, a way of disposing of the defeated enemy while simultaneously explaining human origins? Or is there something more deliberate in the selection of Kingu specifically, a being who held the tablet of destinies, a being who was, however briefly, the most powerful entity in the cosmos, a being whose defining quality was loyalty to the being who created him, loyalty so complete that he went to war on her behalf against gods he could not defeat. If that is what runs in human blood, in the Enuma Elish's understanding of what we are, then the tablets are suggesting something about human nature that is both darker and more interesting than simple servitude. We are made in this telling from the substance of a being who chose devotion over survival, who carried the highest authority and used it not to dominate but to serve, who stood at the center of a cosmic war as the champion of the oldest and most grief-stricken being in existence. This is what the tablets press into the clay in the oldest writing humanity ever produced, about the question of what we are and where we come from. After Kingu's blood is mixed with clay and the first human beings are formed, the Enuma Elish records the response of the assembled gods. They are grateful. The tablets describe a great banquet. The gods gathered together in Esagila, the temple Marduk has built in Babylon, eating and drinking and celebrating the new order of the cosmos. Marduk recites his 50 names, each one a title, each one encoding an aspect of his power and his function in the divine hierarchy, and the assembly repeats them back to him, formally, as an act of recognition and praise. It is a moment of extraordinary ceremony, and it happens in a world that is made from a body, tended by beings made from blood, built in a city constructed by the god who reorganized existence itself after the oldest war ever fought. On those evenings, in the great temple of Babylon, the priests who maintained the rituals of Marduk's cult recited the Enuma Elish in its entirety. They had memorized it. They knew every line. They understood, or believed they understood, the history it was encoding. The history of how the world came to be the way it was, of why the sky sat above the earth, of why the rivers flowed the way they flowed, of why human beings existed at all, and what ran in their blood, and what that blood connected them to. What history often overlooks is that this was not experienced as mythology by the people who performed these rituals. It was experienced as cosmology, as the true account of real events that had occurred before human memory began. The Enuma Elish was recited at the Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, as an act of cosmic renewal. The recitation was understood to literally reinforce the structure of the world, to remind the cosmos of its own order, to keep the sky in its place, and the earth in its place, and the rivers in their courses. The tablets were not stories told around a fire for entertainment or comfort. They were records maintained by specialists, so it's transmitted across generations with extraordinary care for accuracy, copied and recopied in the great scribal schools of Nippur and Babylon and Nineveh, treated in every practical sense as the most important documents in existence. And in those documents, in those careful wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay that has outlasted every dynasty that produced it, the world is described as something built from violence and grief and divine exhaustion. And humanity is described as the being that was made to tend it, shaped from the blood of a defeated champion, set to work in temples built on the divided body of the oldest mother, in a cosmos presided over by gods who are still, even now, working out among themselves the terms of an arrangement that was never entirely settled. The tablets do not say whether any of this troubled the first human beings, but they do say that from the very beginning, the gods could hear them. Their noise rose up through the earth and the sky and reached the assembly where the great Anunnaki sat. And the gods listened, even when they did not want to, even when the listening kept them awake in the long dark of the divine night. They could not stop hearing us. There is a tablet that was found in pieces, not unusual for this tradition. Most of the Anunnaki texts came to modern scholars in fragments, edges broken off, surfaces worn smooth by millennia of earth and moisture, lines missing where the clay had crumbled before anyone with the knowledge to read it could reach it. Scholars are accustomed to working with incomplete things, to holding a fragment in one hand and the ghost of what it once contained in the other, to making careful, qualified judgments about what the missing portions likely said, based on parallel texts, on linguistic patterns, on the internal logic of the narrative. But this particular tablet, found at Nineveh, in the ruins of Ashurbanipal's great library, was different in a way that mattered, because when its fragments were finally assembled, when the pieces were laid out in sequence, and the text was read in its reconstructed form, what emerged was not a creation story, or a flood narrative, or a hymn to a god's power. What emerged was something that had no obvious parallel in any other ancient tradition. It was a list, The Sumerian King List, as scholars have named it, is one of the strangest documents in the entire archaeological record of human civilization. It exists in multiple copies, found at multiple sites, which means it was considered important enough to be reproduced and preserved across generations. Its purpose appears straightforward. It is a record of the kings who ruled the Sumerian city-states, listed in sequence, with the lengths of their reigns recorded beside their names. A historical document in the most basic sense, an attempt to organize the past into a comprehensible order. But the King List does not begin with history as we understand it. It begins somewhere else entirely. The opening lines of the Sumerian King List describe a time before the flood, a period the text calls the time when kingship descended from heaven. And in this period, the text records kings whose reigns last not for decades or centuries, but for spans of time that the modern mind struggles to process. The first king listed, a figure named Alulim, who ruled in the city of Eridu, reigned, the tablet says, for 28,800 years. His successor reigned for 36,000 years. The list continues in this manner through 8 kings and 5 cities, accumulating reigns that total, in the pre-flood period, hundreds of thousands of years. Then the flood came, and after the flood, the king list says simply, the flood swept over the earth. After the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven again, Kish became the seat of kingship, and from that point forward, the reigns recorded in the list become human. They shorten dramatically. The post-flood kings reign for centuries at first, then for decades, then for spans of time that align gradually with what we recognize as ordinary human lifespans. The list moves, in its progression, from the impossible to the plausible, from spans of time that cannot be understood within any framework of normal human biology, to the measured mortal reigns of historical figures, some of whom, like Gilgamesh, listed as the 5th king of Uruk after the flood, appear in other texts and may correspond to real historical rulers. Scholars have proposed many explanations for the extraordinary reigns of the pre-flood kings. Such some suggest they are symbolic, that the enormous numbers encode a theological understanding of the distance between the divine age and the human age, expressed in the numerical language of Sumerian mathematics. Others have noted that the numbers, when examined carefully, them follow specific patterns that suggest they were calculated rather than simply invented, that someone with a sophisticated understanding of Sumerian number systems constructed these figures according to a logic that has not yet been fully decoded. Others still have pointed to the parallel tradition in the Hebrew Bible, where the pre-flood patriarchs, Adam, Methuselah, Noah, also lived for centuries, suggesting that the memory of an age of dramatically extended human lifespans was preserved across multiple ancient traditions independently. What history often overlooks is that the Sumerian king list does not present the pre-flood reigns as miraculous or impossible. It presents them as normal, as the expected condition of kingship in the time before the flood. The text does not pause to explain or justify these numbers. It records them the way you record any historical fact, because For the people who wrote it, that is what they were. This is the quality that makes the king list so difficult to simply categorize and set aside. It is not a mythological text in the way the Atrahasis or the Enuma Elish are mythological texts. It is a historical document, or at least it presents itself as one. And within that historical document, embedded in the same list that records the historical city of Kish and the possibly historical King Gilgamesh, are 8 figures who ruled for spans of time that cannot be accommodated within any understanding of normal human biology. The question the king list quietly poses and does not answer because it does not seem to recognize the question as requiring an answer is what exactly these pre-flood kings were. Whether they were human in the way the post-flood kings were human, whether the beings who ruled in the time when kingship first ascended from heaven were something different from what came after, whether the flood that divides the 2 sections of the list marks not only a geological or climatic event, but a biological one, a change in the nature of the beings who held authority on Earth. The Anunnaki texts offer a possible frame for this question. In the traditions that surround the king list, the earliest rulers of the Sumerian cities were not ordinary human beings. They were described as being closer to the divine, as carrying more of the original substance, the blood and flesh of the slain god that Enki mixed into the clay at the moment of creation. The further humanity moved from that original creation, in this understanding, the more the divine element was diluted. The shorter the lifespans became, the more mortal, in every sense, the species grew. None of this is stated explicitly in the king list itself, but it is the context within which the king list exists, the tradition in which it was produced and preserved and read. And that context suggests that the ancient Sumerians understood the history of their own civilization not as a simple progression from primitive to advanced, but as a gradual descent, a moving away from an original condition of greater power and greater duration toward the diminished, mortal, fully human condition of the present. This is a deeply unusual historical self-understanding. Most civilizations construct narratives of progress, of movement from worse to better, from simpler to more complex, from darkness toward light. The Sumerian understanding encoded in the king list and in the broader Anunnaki tradition moves in the opposite direction. It describes a golden age not in the future, but in the past, a time of direct contact between the divine and the human, a time when the beings who ruled the earth lived so long that the boundary between mortal and immortal was unclear. And it describes the present, the post-flood world of ordinary human kings and ordinary human lifespans, as a world from which something essential has been removed. What was removed in this telling is the fullness of the original inheritance, the divine substance that Wa'ela and Kingu carried into the clay of the first human beings, the proximity to the Anunnaki that the earliest rulers possessed, the lifespan that went with that proximity, the knowledge perhaps that accompanied it, the understanding of the cosmos and its structure that the beings closest to the divine could access, and that became, over generations, harder and harder to reach. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the greatest of all the Anunnaki adjacent texts, is entirely about this loss. Gilgamesh is listed in the Sumerian king list as the fifth king of Uruk after the flood. The epic that bears his name, the oldest narrative poem in human history, composed in a form that was already ancient when the library of Ashurbanipal preserved it, tells the story of a king who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, who is the greatest warrior of his age, who rules the greatest city of his time, and who cannot accept that he will die. The death that Gilgamesh cannot accept is not his own at first. It is the death of his companion Enkidu, a being created by the gods from clay, sent initially to humble Gilgamesh and becoming instead his closest friend, the one person in the world who matches him completely. When Enkidu dies, struck down by the gods as punishment for an act of hubris the two friends committed together, Gilgamesh does something that no great king of his age would be expected to do. He weeps. He refuses to allow Enkidu's body to be buried for 7 days and 7 nights. He sits beside it and watches, the text says, for a worm to fall from his friend's nostril. And when the worm finally comes, when the fact of death makes itself undeniable, Gilgamesh leaves his city and walks out into the wilderness alone. He is looking for Utnapishtim. Utnapishtim is the Babylonian name for the flood survivor, the figure called Atrahasis in the earlier text, called Noah in the Hebrew tradition. He is the one human being who was granted immortality after the flood, lifted out of the mortal condition by the gods as a reward, or perhaps as a necessity, for preserving the seed of life through the waters. He lives, the tablets say, at the mouth of the rivers, at the edge of the world, beyond the waters of death. Gilgamesh walks toward him across the entire known world, through mountains and darkness and the waters that no living person has ever crossed, carrying within him a grief so large it has become indistinguishable from a question. The question is not complicated. It is the simplest question any human being has ever asked. Why must we die? He crosses the waters of death. He finds the one human being who was lifted out of the mortal condition and placed at the edge of the world, beyond the reach of ordinary time. And he asks his question, the question he has carried across mountains and wilderness and the long dark between the living world and whatever lies beyond it. Why must we die? Utnapishtim did not give him the answer he is looking for. He cannot, because the answer, as the tablets understand it, is not the kind of answer that can be given to a person who is still inside the condition they are asking about. What Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh instead is something quieter, something that lands in the careful language of the oldest poem in the world, with the weight of a truth that was always present but never quite visible until this moment. He tells him that death was built into the arrangement, not as punishment, not as cruelty, but as the term that was agreed upon in the assembly of the Anunnaki after the flood, when the gods looked at the species they had made and decided that it could continue, but differently, more contained, more bounded, with a beginning and an end clearly marked, so that the noise would not become again the kind of noise that reached the assembly chamber and disturbed the sleep of the Lord of the earth. Gilgamesh is offered one chance. Utnapishtim tells him of a plant that grows at the bottom of the sea, a plant that can restore youth, that carries within it something of the original vitality of the pre-flood world. Gilgamesh dives for it. He finds it. He holds it in his hands. This small and thorny thing pulled from the deep water, and he decides not to eat it immediately. He will bring it back to Uruk, he tells himself. He will share it with the elders of his city. He will test it first on others before he takes it for himself. On the journey home, he stops to sleep beside a pool of cool water. And while he sleeps, a serpent rises from the pool and takes the plant, eats it, and slips back beneath the surface, leaving behind only the shed skin of its old self on the ground beside the sleeping king. Gilgamesh wakes. He sees the empty ground where the plant had been, and he weeps. For the second time in the epic, this great king, this two-thirds divine ruler of the greatest city of his age, sits down and weeps, not from weakness, from the full and final understanding of what it means to be the thing he is, made from divine substance, living a mortal life, reaching always, but for something that recedes at precisely the moment the hand closes around it. He returns to Uruk. The epic ends not with resolution, but with arrival. Gilgamesh stands before the walls of his city, walls he built, the text reminds us, walls of fired brick that will outlast him, and the poem asks the listener to look at them, to consider what it means that a mortal being made something that will endure, that the hands shaped from clay and divine blood built something that the flood could not destroy and time has not yet finished. The Anunnaki Tablets, taken together, do not offer comfort in the way that later religious traditions would learn to offer it. They do not promise resurrection or paradise or the eventual reunion of the mortal self with the divine source from which it came. They offer something older than comfort, something that requires more of the person who receives it. They offer the truth of what we are, made from the earth and from something that was never entirely of the earth, built for a purpose we did not choose, in a cosmos assembled from the body of the oldest grief in existence, mortal by arrangement, loud enough always to be heard by those above, resilient enough always to survive what was sent to silence us. The tablets are still being read. New fragments still surface from the earth. New translations still refine what we thought we understood. And in the quiet of a museum room, in the weight of a piece of clay held in living hands, the story continues to press itself forward across the impossible distance between that first morning and this one. We woke. We began to work. We built walls that outlasted the ones who built them. And somewhere, in the oldest writing humanity ever produced, pressed into the earth before any other civilization had found its voice, that is recorded, it was always recorded.